Hi, my name's Lloyd Levine.
And my name is Rachel Strassman. And this is
Policy Chats.
Policy Chats is the official podcast of the School of Public Policy at the University of California, Riverside. Policy Chats is our student-produced podcast series where we bring in guests to discuss potential solutions to today's biggest societal challenges through the lens of public policy. While my classmates and I are the usual hosts,
for the next 11 weeks, I will be guest hosting a special series on the intersection of technology and government. This podcast series, sponsored by the Wall Street Journal Higher Education Fund, is based on my recent book, Technology versus Government: The Irresistible Force Meets the Immovable Object. This series explores different aspects of the challenges facing governments as they try to keep pace with the rapidly evolving technology landscape. We will try to understand why it is that government struggles to purchase and integrate modern technologies. We will explore the problems resulting from that technology lag and try to understand the future implications if government does not change its approach to technology integration. The episodes track with the sections and chapters in the book, with a focus on the problems, the people, and the future. Welcome back to Policy Chats. I am Lloyd Levine, host of this special series on technology and government based on my book, Technology versus Government: The Irresistible Force Meets the Immovable Object. We are on episode 4, where we're going to discuss chapter 3 of the book. Joining me today are some incredibly special guests who actually wrote chapter 3 of the book. One of them I know very well because we have a long professional history together. So let's start with Catherine Sandoval, who has an incredible and illustrious career. She is a professor in the School of Law at University of Santa Clara. But I actually reached out to Cathy to contribute to this volume because when we first met, she was a member of the Public Utilities Commission for the state of California. And I wanted this book to not just be academics writing about things, but I wanted policy practitioners as well as academics to write about this as well. And so, Cathy, why don't you just, say a quick hello, introduce yourself, introduce Pat, because I don't actually know Pat that well. You brought Pat into this whole process. And then we could talk a little bit about the book.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, Senator Levine, and really
appreciate the promotion, but Assemblymember.
Assemblymember. Oh, sorry. Well, you appreciate your service to the state of California. So, and thanks as well to UC Riverside and for your hosting of this podcast and the opportunity to contribute a chapter to this important book. So as Lloyd mentioned, I'm a law professor at Santa Clara University School of Law, where I am currently on a leave of absence because I am serving as a presidential appointee on the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. But I am here today not to speak in my official capacity, but in my personal capacity as law professor and author of this book. So just need to say that nothing I say here reflects the positions or policies of the U.S. Chemical Safety Board. So legal disclaimer. This book was also a great opportunity, and working with Pat, who I met through the California Emerging Technology Fund Board of Expert Advisors, really gave us the opportunity to link together issues in the digital divide and disaster prevention and response, which is an issue that I've had to deal with in many of my positions in terms of infrastructure and other disasters, now chemical disasters. And looking at the linkage between that and the digital divide was something that we explored in this chapter. So I'll let Pat tell you a little bit more about his tremendous background, especially in disaster preparation and response. So Pat?
Thank you. So I'm Pat LANTHIER, and I've been involved in telecommunications policy for a long time, probably 40 years now. And most of the time, it's been a real challenge. And I think the title of the book emphasizes that technology versus government. However, there are also times where we've been able to work with regulators and with legislators and with the executive branches to do some amazing things. So what I would like to propose, and at some point, I don't know when, is to sort of refocus this effort to what are the solutions? What can we do together so that citizens benefit, that we can do things that are absolutely amazing with the technologies that are emerging. And I think AI, for example, and I love the chapter in the book about AI, because I think AI is going to have a profound effect on virtually every sector that we deal with. And particularly in around disaster relief, my business card, I have a small company called RIVERA LANTHIER. My business card says, from chaos to synergy.
Mhm.
So the synergy that we can help create via the right policies and the right people like Lloyd and like you, Kathy, and Rachel, you, that we can do amazing things with the technology that's coming aboard, and hopefully we do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And while this chapter isn't about AI, let's touch on that later. I do want to introduce Rachel. Rachel Strassman, who runs the podcast for UC Riverside, is one of our top students, and is always a great presence to have on this, because you're just so well informed beyond your age, and you're the exact target audience that this book is in large part about. So what I usually like to do on these is start with a little bit of summary. So I'm going to give a little context. Chapter 3 that you guys wrote is in the first section of the book. And Pat, I couldn't agree more. This book is not a lamentation or a recitation of things that went wrong, and just another cataloging to beat up on government. Most, not all, most of the chapters took some sort of case study approach, as yours did, to illustrate what the problems were. And the instructions that I gave to all of the authors, including myself, which you guys hit out of the park, was essentially just that. Don't just make this, about the problems. At the end, suggest alternatives and possibilities. So the first chapter actually has, first section of the book has 3 different chapters. The first chapter is on structures of government. Second chapter is on administrative failures. And yours, the third chapter, encapsulates the missing component there, policy failures. So why don't you guys kick us off? What I don't want and I have no fear that it's going to go there, but what I've always said is this is not intended to summarize the book. It's like people who put up PowerPoint slides and read them. Like, I can read the slides, give me some more information. But I do want to start with a summary of the chapter, and then use that as a launching point for discussions, policy changes. What are the things that we can do to create the climate, the policy climate, to get better outcomes? So why don't we start with, Pat and Kathy, why don't you do a quick summary of the chapter? What is it? What were the findings? And go from there.
Great, thank you. Well, I think the title of the chapter is a good reference point, and again, I have to thank Pat for helping us to think about the title of the chapter and the approach, which is connect the whole community. So actually, if you get nothing else out of this discussion, out of reading our chapter or this discussion, I would say it is that mantra: connect the whole community. And this really comes from the whole community approach to disaster management, which is that in disaster prevention and management, that you need to have the whole community engaged in disaster planning in order to be able to appropriately respond to disasters when they happen. Because if you don't do that, you will never understand what the needs are. And we can talk about many examples of that. And in fact, the chapter gives some examples of what I think are wildly inappropriate standards, for example, about flooding and dam inundation, right? Where the government imagines that the flood isn't high severity if you can survive it by clinging to a shelter, such as clinging to a tree. Okay, so, an incredibly ableist, ageist perspective, that it seems to be willing to write off people with disabilities, the elderly, young children, in those scenarios. So just thinking about connect the whole community in the context of disaster planning, I think that whole way of thinking helps us to think about why this imperative is so compelling, right? And part of what our chapter seeks to do is to connect that relationship between disaster planning and the digital divide. And that relationship really has been under theorized and understudied. And so we also give examples where, for example, policymakers have used really what we think are inappropriate ways to communicate with the people about impending disasters, whether floods or wildfires, by requiring prior sign up for phone alert services, not using radio or television alerts. And this comes again from a failure to understand the information needs of the community, the information assets available to the community. And so they're not reaching people effectively in a way that can really help people. And this ends up costing lives and costing money. It costs the insurance industry money, it costs cities and localities money. And so if we planned these things better and really were able to do more in terms of also doing an analysis where we layered our understanding of hazards, then we could better prepare our community for disaster. And the last thing I would say is disaster is should be thought of not simply as there's a wildfire right now today in California. We're under wildfire alerts. Millions of people have had their power cut off by PG&E because of high winds and wildfire. Flooding. We've seen tremendous flooding as a result of hurricanes in the east. But things like COVID, which was a long, slow folding disaster that has now become endemic to our population. So really connecting the whole community is key to community and indeed national resilience, capacity, and success. So I'll pause there because Pat has really used this theory of connecting the whole community in disaster preparation, and Pat can add some more on that.
And before we let Pat, it's really interesting to me the way you just phrased that, Kathy. So I put your chapter third in this section because I thought there was a great segue from your chapter to chapter four. This really is not just a collection of works, but really it is a book. And you talked about, the way you talked about, the people impacted in chapter three is, and then specifically where you just articulated correctly so that a disaster isn't just the hurricanes or the fires or the tornadoes that we've seen, but the pandemic. And we actually talk about that in chapter four and then again a little bit in chapter five, where we look at the impact on we use those as case studies. I actually co-authored both chapters 4 and 5 case studies to look at the impact of technologies and lack thereof on e-government. We used the pandemic as a case study to look and say, okay, well, who has, how did this impact people and where's the miss? And what we found is relatively similar to what you're saying. The majority of people who utilize e-government services are the more well-off, digitally literate. The people who utilize the majority of government services, not e-government, looking at the data from the U.S. Census Bureau, are the exact same populations: the elderly, low-income, and minority communities, and that's a gap there. And so that plays out, which is specifically why the order was chosen. Pat, would you like to add to what Kathy just said there?
Yeah, just briefly. First of all, Lloyd, I wanted to thank you so much for helping to do this, or leading the effort to do this book and this podcast, or whatever it's called. I recall working with you, I don't know, time flies, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I don't know, with Sonny McPeak and so forth. And I've always viewed you as a forward-looking person around policy and also around technology. And that combination is really what we need in our leadership. And fundamentally, that's what I think is the key issue in bringing technology and government together. It's leadership. And I've seen it around the world. I've worked in over 100 countries. And different systems produce different results, you know, whether it be a dictatorship or a democracy or whatever. But the common theme is there enlightened leadership in whatever system you're in that will push for what the Singaporeans did, and they created a whole program called Go For It. That is, they transformed their economy from a rickshaw economy to an information-rich economy, positioned it for leadership in global markets. It's a little tiny island. And here it transformed itself. Same thing happened in California. The same thing happened in California, working with the California Commission, working with the legislature, working with the governor. We created this new regulatory framework. This was back in the early 90s, late 80s. What that resulted in was over $1 billion of investment going in to position California to be part of this new thing called the information age, the internet, okay? Part of that whole process was not just the technology, but also we worked with people like you, Lloyd, and other people in government, Sonny McPeak and so forth, that we gave them computers. And we taught them about this new thing called the information age and the internet. And we even created a task force, the information age technology task force, okay? That was picked up by the federal government. And I was flying back and forth to Washington quite often to look at this magic that's happening in California. My whole point of mentioning that all this is that it's about leadership. It's about leadership, regardless of what kind of system your government's in. It's all about leadership. And I hope people get that out of the book and whatever happens after that.
I think to me, it's about two things. I agree. It's about leadership and it's about culture change.
Yes.
Changing the technology culture in government and the culture overall. The interplay between the administrative branch and the legislative branch. And really focused on the technology culture and understanding it. And there's a disconnect that exists there now, and trying to overcome that for the betterment of, I mean, as trite as it may sound, the betterment of the future.
But Lloyd, I just want to clarify. I include culture in my definition of leadership. I think it's absolutely critical.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and I would add to that. So thus, the second part of the title after the colon, which is leadership gaps drive the digital divide and fuel disaster and social vulnerabilities. So part of our point, the point of the chapter, is that when you look at social vulnerability and disaster vulnerability, is that is constructed by leadership gaps, right? And it is socially constructed. So we draw from the field as well of vulnerability science, which has looked a lot at especially geography and location, and that plays a huge role in vulnerability. But vulnerability is also constructed by leadership decisions. And so thus you also get, for example, some very vulnerable people right here in the Silicon Valley, where you had more than 10,000 people who were unconnected or underconnected to the internet. And it also just so happened to be that many of them lived in exactly the zone where the outlet was for the Anderson Dam. And so there was a confluence of man-made vulnerability to the rain creating an overflow of the dam and thus a natural disaster, but layered on top of digital vulnerability. And so the leadership to see the imperative, well, to see the problem, one, that's half the battle sometimes, is understanding the particular problem. And then the imperative of addressing it is why we connected leadership to the goal of connecting the whole community.
So for those who haven't read the chapter yet, A, I encourage you to go do so. B, for a little context, the case study that they used was the Anderson Dam failure in the Silicon Valley. And that was disaster number one. And the vulnerability that they're talking about is the thousands of people in the path of the flood who, because of the policy failure to provide them adequate and widespread communications technologies, left them unable to receive notifications about the impending flood, and therefore put them in physical harm's way because of that. But again, that was to me, that was a launching point. It is not about one dam failure. It's not about the failure of one dam. It's about the policy problems that led to that. If it was about the one dam, that's an easier fix. It's about policy problems in communities around the country that that might leave folks exposed. But with the proper technology leadership, not just leadership, but technology leadership prior to the disaster, because you can't impose a technological solution after the disaster's occurred. Running around and handing out cell phones while people are clinging to trees doesn't work. What are the policies? What are the things that government can do prior to a disaster? And again, using the term disaster broadly, what are some of the policy solutions or administrative? I mean, policy and administrative, solutions that government could take to mitigate against the unfortunate outcomes of a disaster.
Yeah, so I'm glad you connected those two, because what I would say, it's when I say leadership, we already talked about, I include culture in that. I also view that as the in a broad sense. That is, it's got to also connect to implementation. So just the fact that something was written about something and the fact that maybe a law was passed is not enough.
Amen.
Okay, I'll give you an example of that. Happened right here in California. We did this Education First project, $100 million to get schools connected and so forth. And we worked with Hewlett Packard, for example, and Apple, others, to create a task force. And we actually gave away computers to schools and connections to schools. And we were tracking it, we thought. And I just decided, a couple of us decided to go visit a school. It's just in a Bay Area county. I'm not going to name it, but a Bay Area county that was rather affluent. And yeah, they had counted all the computers that we gave them, and they were acting like they were all connected. They were being used as doorstops. Okay, because there was no follow-up to even the commitment to implement. So there was no sort of accounting of what happened from the fact that you created a task force, did some things, created some funding with the California Commission, et cetera, what really happened. And I think that what the implementation piece of it needs to be folded into the overall thinking. It's absolutely required. And, I've seen it happen in Africa. I've seen it happen in Asia and so forth. And frankly, some other governments and other entities do it a lot better than we do.
Truth, accuracy, fairness, curiosity. These are the pillars of journalism and of higher education. At the Wall Street Journal, we pride ourselves on being a trusted and essential resource. The Wall Street Journal is partnered with the University of California, Riverside to provide your campus an unparalleled access to essentials to be prepared academically, professionally, and personally. Students get full access to WSJ News, curated newsletters, challenges, podcasts, and documentary series to help stay up to date. Activate your school-sponsored subscription today at wsj.com/UC Riverside.
Well, it's funny you say that. I've been talking, I mean, I'll go back a decade now. The older I get, and I'm not old, but the older I get, the greater appreciation for and importance I put in implementation or the administratability of the policy.
Good.
It's something I've stressed in my role at Riverside. Administration is often thought as the lesser intellectual, stepchild of policy creation. Oh, I'm a policy creator. I do not deign to do implementation. But without implementation, your policy is going to fall flat.
Yeah.
And so I think it's incredibly important. And for me, the culture that you talked about, Pat, of changing the perception of the importance of implementation. What are the metrics that legislators are judged by these days? Well, how many bills did you pass? How many bills did you pass? How many bills did you pass?
Exactly.
Not what did those bills do, not what was the effect of those bills on people, but how many bills did you pass? And I think changing that perspective could go, a long way in shifting where we are now. I want to turn to Rachel for a second. So again, we talk about in this book, one of the concepts that is underlying the book from the introduction throughout is what I call Generation T. And for those who haven't heard me describe it before, maybe you're just joining us for the first time, Generation T is the group of individuals born 2002 and later. They're the first group in American history born wrapped completely in a technology bubble. Broadband to the home was deployed, first in 2000. It reached 70% penetration in 2010. The iPhone came out in 2007. If you were born in 2002 or later, you don't remember a world where nearly everybody had a cell phone. You don't remember a world in which broadband and tablets, et cetera, laptops weren't relatively ubiquitous around your household. This is the generation who reflexively engages with the world via technology first. And so, as we tie that concept with what you talked about disaster preparedness in with some of the other chapters later in the book, the disaggregation of media, social media, Rachel, how is your generation? And I guess I would go back to UC Riverside. One of the principles or one of the biggest attributes of UC Riverside. It's always one of the top 5 to 10 universities in the country that has first generation college students who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, some of them in the Inland Empire. How do you think your fellow students and their families are prepared relating to kind of what Pat and Kathy were talking about disaster preparedness? How would they fare in any type, or how did they fare during the pandemic? And that was probably just a little bit before you were at Riverside, but how did they fare maybe in high school, those who didn't necessarily have access to the technologies?
Yeah, I think the pandemic is a good example in the sense that it was very, very unprecedented. And I feel like even I remember months and months into the pandemic, it still felt like we were in crisis mode. And there wasn't even talking about schools and getting laptops, getting laptops to students. The school district I went to during COVID did not have any laptops for students automatically. So once they finally got around to being able to provide us with laptops, they then realized not everyone in our city has access to Wi-Fi. And then how do we set up those Wi-Fi hotspots? And then, even if we can set up Wi-Fi near the library, how can we ensure that student's parents can even drive them there? Are they going to even be supervised if they're accessing that Wi-Fi? And to be honest, a lot of those issues never fully got addressed, where it would just be like, this is the best we can do for now. We're just going to have to deal with it. And it definitely had a lot of impacts back when I was in high school. I think now in Riverside, the beauty of UC Riverside is that they are very inclusive and understanding of the diverse backgrounds our students come from. So there are so many accommodations. Most buildings on campus, I can check out a free laptop for the day pretty easily within a couple minutes. I can get access to Wi-Fi. Our library services have expanded their hours significantly since my first year here at Riverside to allow for students who need access to that Wi-Fi to complete assignments and spaces to go ahead and get their work done. And they even offer like free evening parking to try to accommodate students that can't afford the very expensive parking passes. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunities. And even Riverside, the way that they go about emergency notification systems, as we just had the Great California Shakeout the other day, every single student got a text, got like 3 phone calls to remind us to practice for an earthquake. And I think that's definitely a way that they're trying to be more inclusive of all of the students. But actually, if I may,
Sure.
Pat, you had mentioned earlier talking about implementation and the importance of policy implementation, and how it kind of gets put to the side a little. I was wondering what your thoughts were on, in terms of policy evaluation and even just data collection in general to inform policies. How can data collection and analysis be collected to better understand and address these vulnerabilities we're talking about in communities, especially in terms of digital access?
Well, I would say that the best way to really understand what's going on in terms of implementation is to include the whole community. In other words, to set up a community-based task force right from the beginning, not just something that occurs in the university or some other government entity, but one that includes police, fire, schools, religious leaders, and so forth. So they are vested then in making sure implementation happens. It's not simply a matter of some legislator who passes a bill with their name on it, and they're the only one who's really vested in it. Is that you create that investment of people right at the beginning. You get their input on how you design it, and you implement it with the team. And I think that's the best solution. I've seen it. Well, I've been part of that working in other communities.
And thank you very much for giving a plug for Chapter 7, where we talk about the use of collaboration technologies to improve citizen engagement, to bring in people who, as you've kind of both said, can't drive to wherever because they've got childcare and they can't afford a babysitter. And whatever the circumstance might be, utilizing technologies to include more people gives you richer access to information and better decision making. So thank you guys for giving the
I'd like to add one point to that,
Of
an
course, go ahead.
example. So we had the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. There was collapse. Probably the biggest thing was the collapse of the freeway in Oakland area, okay? And we talk often about first responders, meaning police, fire, et cetera. The first responders to that disaster in that area were the low-income people who lived in the neighborhoods. They came out, crawled under rubble, and helped the people immediately. It took a long time for the official first responders to get there. So community is absolutely critical here.
So, Kathy, it's a shame. I mean, I was listening to what Rachel said. It's a shame that nobody knew about the digital divide until we got to the pandemic. If only people had been talking about it earlier. So again, for those of you who may not get the inside joke there, Kathy and I spent a good decade plus prior to the pandemic trying to talk about the digital divide and the importance of closing it. And it wasn't until the pandemic that the rest of the world really caught up. And it's like, oh, I guess there really is a digital divide. And it's like, yeah, we've kind of been trying to tell you about that. The importance of that pre-planning, for digital collaborations. One of the challenges that I think is maybe it's a leftover culture, leftover mindset. Maybe the pandemic changed it. Was there's a segment of the population, and you identified them, both in the chapter and earlier in this conversation. And I would add one thing to you. You talked about how they're vulnerable because of they're also vulnerable because of economy. They don't have the monetary assets to be part of the same level of participation, and there's historically always been that. I mean, you and I know this very well. You go back to the Rural Electrification Act, the Rural Telecom Act. These were government policies going back 100 years, designed to bring marginalized communities along with everybody else. There's always going to be marginalized economic communities. I'd like there not to be. We certainly need to shrink the income gap, but there's always going to be the people lagging behind. So 2 questions. One, how do we address those people lagging behind? And then the second part of that is, one of the things I've talked about is potentially a shift in mindset of government now, where in the past, government didn't provide devices. We provided benefits, we provided, all sorts of things, but we didn't actually provide devices. And might there actually be an overall benefit to society as well as an economic savings by the government providing devices that allow people to connect, not just for disaster response, but as we talked about in in a couple of the other chapters in the book, but also to connect to services that might help lift them out of poverty. How do you, as a former regulator, who in that role was also a policymaker, how do you see the idea of actually the government providing devices to individuals? I know historically, well, we can't give people iPhones, and as I say, the iPhone, first of all, it doesn't have to be an iPhone. Second of all, these days, the internet is a tool, not a toy. Have we reached a tipping point? Do you think the future is government actually just providing devices to people?
So let me address that question first, and then I want to get into some of the background about, how did we get to that point?
Great.
Which is, so first of all, I think that we need to identify where do we have network access gaps? Okay, because devices in places where there's no network are, doorstops, right? So they're bricks. And so, Rachel, when you were mentioning Wi-Fi hotspots, that was also a problem because even where some districts were giving out Wi-Fi hotspots, if there's no network to connect to, your Wi-Fi hotspot is a hockey puck. It doesn't do anything, right? So, so number one is network access. And, this gets back to some surprising gaps in network access. Again, even here in the Silicon Valley, and especially as we look at the future, well, even the present, where you have a need for faster internet speeds to be able to do things like we're doing right now for, simultaneous video conferencing, for teleconferencing with your doctor, teleconferencing with a job, with your class, let alone for things like geographic information systems require very high speeds. And then especially when you have a family where there are multiple people in the household all using the internet at the same time, your speed requirements really go up. And so the question is, do we have deployment of those networks, even in urban areas, let alone in suburban, exurban, rural, and tribal areas to provide people with that access? And so the answer is it's spotty. And so the California Public Utilities Commission had been doing this mapping work for a long time. We had been sending people out to rural areas and getting people in 4-H clubs and tribes involved in documenting access gaps in their areas. The Congress finally ordered the FCC to improve, but we also need to be looking at, do we have the speeds that are necessary really to address the needs, not just for now, but the needs in the future, right? As our needs are going to be growing. So you have to think about network access is a predicate to being able to have devices be useful, right?
So I'm
So
laughing, Kathy, because you and I were having coffee in Long Beach. I don't remember the year, but it's been a few years. And I remember you said something, and I have quoted it a million times, and now I get the chance to quote yourself back to you. The Internet of Things without the internet is just things, or apparently hockey pucks. But you're right, and I probably should I put the cart before the horse. You're right. I presupposed an access that may not necessarily be there. So, anyways, didn't mean to interrupt, but I just was laughing at that kind of full circle moment there.
yeah, because I actually want to talk about the role of the Internet of Things. So so that was a good reminder about that quote. So yeah, so we have to think about network access and reliable, resilient, high-speed network access, right? And then you need to think about device access. And we need to think about training and support, right? And models for that, because I think a lot of our government models really have focused on um, looking at people in a deficit mode. and by that I mean the people have an income deficit, right? Or the people have a training deficit, as opposed to looking at how do we build assets that are necessary not just for people, but for our community. And also seeing that these investments are not simply investments in individuals or families or particular communities, but they're investments for society, right? And so that's in part what Pat was talking about, was how do you transform a society, right, in terms of its technological capacity, economic capacity, and its future. So really trying to marry network access with training and support, right? I think I actually am paying for 2 different tech support systems, to be able to be on standby, in addition to, I can get the university resources, and for my government job, I have the government resources for tech support. But, I'm in a position to be able to pay for additional tech support for, the occasional crisis, let alone the broad, the updates we got to do all the time. Um, so, thinking about how we do that, right? This is all part of the system. It's a system for information needs and literacy that really should be starting with schools and education, but should be provided in an ongoing way. And part of this, I think, is the question that Pat suggested other countries are asking themselves is, what is our economic future, right? And how do we enable our population and our society? And then I'd like to come back to the Internet of Things, but I'll pause there.
Well, no, I think what you raised is really some excellent issues. And I think you're right. I've argued in multiple places recently, we're creating a bifurcated system of service delivery, bigger picture service delivery. Some people have to go to a physical location. Other people can navigate it utilizing the internet. What kinds of efficiencies could we gain? If you don't have means at home to connect, do you have to take time off of your job to drive somewhere? What are the distances people have to go? I looked at some, places in rural California where to get to certain government offices where you might need to go regularly for benefits, unemployment offices, disability insurance offices. It's 100, 150, 200-mile drive to reach some of these things if you don't have internet access. So it's not just about, as I gave a speech at Santa Clara, as a matter of fact, titled, "It's not just about cat videos on YouTube anymore." It is truly about not just the well-being of the individual, but the collective economic advancement of society. So I want to ask you a question before we go to Internet of Things, and I know we still need to get back to AI. And I actually have an interesting case study on AI and disaster avoidance, not just prevention, but avoidance. You talked about schools, and I've kind of posited this. Now I want to caveat this with, I grew up relatively poor. I've come a long way from where I was. I grew up in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment until I was in 6th grade, before my parents were able to afford a small, house. They bought a car before I entered kindergarten. It had hand crank, windows, vinyl bench seats, stick shift on the column. They had that same car when I graduated from college or from high school. So, where I am now is very different, which is maybe perhaps why I'm more empathetic. I'd like to think I would have been empathetic anyway. My kids we have more devices than people in my household. My kids had, during the pandemic, they had tech support built in. I could do any number of things. How do you address, and I agree with you, Kathy, wholeheartedly, that schools can and should play a better role. In my kids' school district, I think 30% of the kids didn't have internet access prior to the pandemic, and the school had to, spend 3 weeks scrambling to get internet access, to figure out how they're going to get the access, then get devices, then get them deployed. Mercifully, they had a spring break weekend, so the kids only missed about 2 weeks worth of education as they figured that out. But how do we create an educational system that supports the technological needs of a community? And before I give you that completely open-ended question, I also want to add on, if something happens at 9 o'clock at night, I'm there to fix it. What about those kids whose parents don't have the digital literacy skills to come in and fix it, or the kids who are, dependent upon access at Starbucks? How do we create parity for those individuals, and how do we put schools or whatever, if it isn't schools, at the center of the technological landscape and modernize that technological community landscape?
Yeah. So, so I think, first of all, you're right to also just remind us, right, about the technological disparities in access among many people in our community. So, when I was young, my family first lived in a trailer park in East Los Angeles, and then we moved up to the barrio, right, where we got to live in an apartment. And eventually my family moved because my parents said there was too much arson in our neighborhood. So, as an adult, led me to ask the question, when was there the acceptable level of arson? But and through some of my further research, I've also found out, in looking at one aspect of the digital divide called digital discrimination, which Congress ordered the Federal Communications Commission to adopt rulemaking to investigate, that the FCC has identified this ongoing linkage, right? Talk about social historical construction of the digital divide, between communities that had been classified by the federal government as redlined, as a high risk in terms of loan rates for housing, and the digital divide today. So in fact, communities like mine, when I looked up the neighborhood that I grew up in East LA, after we moved from the trailer park to the barrio, uh, it is I lived in a bright redlined community. And that community today, not surprisingly, doesn't have gigabit internet. They don't have 100 megabit internet, right? They don't have the high speeds. So when I was a kid, I was able to learn more about the world and develop my reading skills because the bookmobile would come to my neighborhood once every couple of weeks. And after I had read a lot of the books in my elementary school, then I blew through the bookmobile. But it literally brought the world to my doorstep. But if you've got internet access with the now even an internet enabled bookmobile once every 2 weeks, that's not going to be enough to cut
Okay,
it in the
can I
modern
stop
world.
you? Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that, because too often that is the solution. Rachel talked about it earlier. I saw it here in Sacramento and I observed it firsthand. And I appreciate the effort on one hand, where we put internet-enabled buses in places to, oh, well, the students can come use the internet, and it had like a third of a mile radius. And I went to look at a few of those. I never saw any kids there, and in some places there was not a single residence within a third of a mile. And I have long said, that if you have internet access at home versus the kids who have to go to Starbucks or the library, your academic outcomes are going to be much, much more successful. And I think we focus too often on providing, not that we shouldn't do both, but providing internet access at a location that people can go to as a
Right.
be-all, end-all policy outcome. And I think what you just said was so important. I want to stop you and just emphasize that doing that still makes somebody beholden to the library hours, the number of computers available, Starbucks hours, and it still creates a digital disparity. So I apologize for the interruption, but please go ahead.
Oh,
It was
yeah,
important.
that's great. And that's a point that we make in the book chapter as well, that a lot of our current programs have relied on people being what we call internet migrants, where they're actually having to migrate, even that distance, to the coffee shop, to the library, to some park, to visit the internet, right, and then leave. And so this is why the California Emerging Technology Fund, which is a nonprofit that was in part created by the California Public Utilities Commission, has defined, when we talk about ending the digital divide and developing sufficient internet access for everyone, that it needs to include robust, reliable internet access at home. Right? Relying on internet migrants, do your homework on the curb is ridiculous. And you are absolutely right that what we are looking at is social stratification that is going to hurt everyone. And where you see that, like a lot of these internet deployment plans, if we let internet deployment be driven solely by profit, naturally they're going to deploy in higher income neighborhoods. And so you will get the kids in Beverly Hills who will have a 10, 15, 20-year head start over the kids in East LA or in Riverside. And when you look at a 15, 20-year head start, that means your entire elementary, secondary education, your entire college education, if you get there, and several years of work. We're skipping generations, right? And when you look at it from a global perspective, that's what other countries have decided to stop doing that, right? So I think that, again, we've got to look at this as what does it take for our society to be successful, right? So that we're all able to get these assets, which have now really become basic. And when now what we're doing is we are filtering more of society's resources through the internet. So if you think about the coffee funnel, right, the internet is becoming the funnel that you pour resources through, whether it's education, work, telehealth. My husband and I just did a telehealth visit yesterday with his doctor. But if you don't have access to the internet, or the devices or wherewithal for how to use them, it really decreases your access and increases healthcare costs, increases educational delivery costs, increases all kinds of things and reduces efficacy.
What you're really talking about, not tell you what you're talking about, but what you're really talking about, and we talk about this, in future chapters, is a mindset shift, a culture shift, Pat, to a digital transformation of society. Not, oh, I've got mine and you've got, and you can fend for yourself, but a mindset from the policy level, because this is a policy, this chapter is about policy, from the policy level of a digital transformation to enable a more efficient, an effective government and society. So, Rachel, you've now sat through, this is chapter 3. You've sat through, podcasts on the structure of government in the first one, where John Thomas Smith and I sat around, and John Thomas Flynn, and I sat around and talked about the structure of government and how that impacts technology. And then we've talked about in the second one, Professor McLean and I discussed the administrative side of things and how that led to the structure and decision-making problems within the administration led to a huge technology failure, or a couple technology failures. And now we've spent a good bit of time talking about policy, although we still need to talk about Internet of Things and AI here. Kind of as you're sitting here listening to somebody who's in policy school right now, you're in a dual program, graduate and undergraduate. How does your education, what they've taught you in school, and what you're hearing in these 3 podcasts, how does that shape your views on technology and government as somebody who grew up a digital native?
Yeah, thank you. I think that, and this is kind of the way that they've shaped the teaching in general for policy here at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. But also what I've learned from these episodes is that with policy and technology policy, you can't really come in with your preconceived notions about accessibility and availability. Because if you had asked me like 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said probably that most people in the world have access to the internet, or at least in the US, which is a completely untrue and uninformed perspective. And I think that's why they stress so much truly to do the research and get the background information to understand the populations of which a policy is supposed to address. That way, every decision that you put forward, even every policy problem that you form, is well informed. I think the different chapters in this book bring light different aspects of technology gaps and different policy areas that can fill those gaps. And it shows there is still to be done, unfortunately.
No, appreciate that perspective. It's always interesting to hear that. Pat, you look like you're about to say something. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, actually, I would like to ask Rachel and then get her comments from the two of you as well. One thing we haven't really talked about in this call is wireless services. So Rachel, could you live without your iPhone or whatever kind of phone you use?
Probably I would not, I feel like there's some things I live without, but the things I have to do on my phone, I don't think I would be able to.
Exactly. So we haven't really talked about wireless yet, but in my view, the same kind of issues that we've been talking about on the internet in terms of access and so forth. And I worked in cellular from the very beginning at AT&T Bell Laboratories. And frankly, we had this cool technology. We did not have a clue about the impacts of wireless. We really did not. And if you look around the world now, the impacts are, in my view, greater than the internet, because people use their voice for internet access for everything. And yet there are places, including the United States, particularly Lloyd was talking about rural areas, particularly in rural areas, there's no even in California, there's no cellular service. And yet I've seen, for example, in refugee camps in Africa, where the people who come to get relief, instead of what they used to do is where's food and water, now they ask where's Wi-Fi. And it's like, you think of the changes people have gone through, and yet do we have the right policy frameworks, even in the US, or maybe more in the US? I saw much greater wireless coverage in Scandinavia than I've seen in the United States.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. I know you were asking Rachel, so I'm going to let Rachel answer that. But before, but I got something I want to say here. So Rachel, go ahead.
Or you can actually go ahead and go first, and I can go after you.
No, you don't want to do that. Go ahead. Could you live without your iPhone? And then how essential is wireless access versus wireline access to you right now?
Yeah, I think. Thank you for that, Lloyd, and you as well, Pat. I think wireless internet is like the core of everything I do. I would say I do have wired internet in my apartment, and that's my one exception. And not just because I live in a more outdated apartment. But everything I do, like even assignments, I submit those frequently on my phone. I work on them at a computer on campus, and then I go onto my phone and I can upload them. There's, I think, so much decreased availability that I would have to do everything I do every day without my phone. And I think with people my age, we frequently will check our screen time on our phones to see how truly reliant we are. And I mean, from texting, even if it's for work, to checking assignments, announcements from teachers, I'm probably on my phone, I would say, for at least 5 hours a day when you put it all together. And that's honestly one of the lower amounts of screen time I've seen, where I know people who can have screen times of like 8 to 10 hours per day on their phone. And that doesn't even include the other devices that they use with wireless internet.
And just to be clear, I said you don't want to follow me because as a recovering politician, I can't be as concise as you are. And by the time I was done talking, you would have lost your point, and it almost would have been moot. And I really did want to hear kind of your perspective on that, because when I was growing up, I would always say, there's 3 things I don't leave the house without, my keys, my wallet, and my inhaler, because I have asthma and God forbid something happens. And now I don't leave the house without my keys, my wallet, my inhaler, and my cell phone. So it's interesting you're talking about policy failures. We're talking about policy failures because that's the genesis of this discussion based on your chapter. And I think we've totally cleared the bar of not just summarizing the chapter here. So full disclosure, I work for T-Mobile, nation's premier 5G provider. And I'm not making this a plug about T-Mobile. The core of what we do, we don't have wireline. We've acquired a little bit of fiber here and there. We are a mobile first company. But we're now, and again, not to make this a commercial, but for perspective, we're now the 5th largest home internet provider in the country. We have and 5G, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's broadband. It's the way I describe 5G to folks is it's like an electric vehicle. One car goes down the freeway at 70 miles an hour on gas. The other goes down the freeway at 70 miles an hour on electricity. They both have air conditioning. They both have radios. They both have comfortable seats. They both have power windows. The propulsion system is different, but they both get you, from one place to another at the same speeds. And that's for the most part what 5G does. I was on campus actually, earlier this year, and I remember doing a speed test on my phone, and I got 1.1 gigs walking across campus, not connected to the campus network. Just that's what I got, and you can replay that story, across the country. So I do see actually too many, policymakers, currently regulators still with a wireline first mindset. And I agree. I've seen wireless around the world. One of the things you didn't touch on, Pat, that I think is interesting is the impact on the unbanked individuals of fintech advancements in other parts of the world utilizing their cell phones and therefore a cell phone network as a financial services tool. And so I think there's a lot that can be learned from those sorts of examples, where we don't view any longer wireless as an inferior technology. There are still some advantages. Like, Rachel, if you had to do your term papers on your phone, how successful would you be? If you were applying for, trying to do a resume on your phone, how successful would you be? But there are other technologies that, that are out there. There's, and again, trying to balance the neutrality of where we are versus what I know through work. T-Mobile has a solution called CPR3. I've shown it to Rochelle Chong, Kathy. She loved it. Sunny and I met, and I demonstrated it to her. Essentially, it threads the needle, and it isn't a full computing device, but CPR3 stands for connecting people to resources, and it aggregates government resources in the palm of your hand. And there's now 45,000 people across the country who have those devices. Everything from, Afghani immigrants who get devices to help connect them to education, food, housing resources, to in Oregon, the Oregon Youth Authority uses it to reduce the recidivism rate and increase the education level. So I think as we look at wireless, talking about tech, policy failures, I'm going to turn to Kathy, the regulator of these industries, or former regulator of these industries. How do you look at wireless, policy failures? Was it, in the past versus the go forward, where we still seem to be wireline dominant?
Yeah, so as we think about wireless and wireline, I would also look at part of the underlying frame. And again, part of what we talked about in the book is the UN has specifically, the United Nations has identified communications as aid. So that's a really important framework. And, again, I thank Pat for introducing me to some of that, the work in that field, right? Where, think of how profound that is. Refugees who are asking for charging and Wi-Fi before they are asking for food and shelter. And it's something that we've recognized here in California with the efforts, for example, to bring Wi-Fi onto fairgrounds, where we have evacuation zones, that these evacuation zones needed to be equipped with primarily Wi-Fi, because anytime you're evacuating people, you're often trying to get people to file insurance claims. They're trying to connect with friends and family. Maybe they're still trying to do work. They're trying to do school. So having that Wi-Fi is absolutely essential to being able to provide aid. And, with a number of these disasters, you also get to the point where the infrastructure has been destroyed. Sometimes both some of the wireless infrastructure as well as the wireline. So it's important, first of all, to remind ourselves that with wireless infrastructure, it's really the last few feet that is wireless. But 90% of a wireless call is wireline, because it connects at various cell phone towers and other types of infrastructure to the backbone resources, including the internet, which is fed by what I call the increasingly fiber, but the copper fiber octopus, right? So a wireless call is not truly wireless. Okay, it's not a walkie-talkie, right? So it's really this hybrid of wireless and wireline. And then I think from a policy perspective, the reason why a lot of regulators have continued to
But
push
let me stop.
wireless. Yeah.
You're 100% correct in that. I wouldn't say the last few feet. I'd say the last mile to a couple of miles, depending upon where you are. But it does allow for a whole host of activities of a wide variety of types to be untethered from a physical location. Wi-Fi, essentially, instead of having Wi-Fi in your building and then leaving, it's Wi-Fi everywhere. And so, bringing this back to what we were talking about at the beginning, disaster preparedness, Wi-Fi is or wireless technologies, cellular-based wireless technologies are critical for emergency first responders. Especially in California, you talk about, a lot of times where the base stations need to be headquartered for firefighter efforts in fire zones, they're not conveniently located right next to large buildings with excellent Wi-Fi. And the only way is to bring large-scale mobile technologies that can provide Wi-Fi, because that is critical communications. In 2024, trying to fight a fire without that critical communications link is impossible. So, I mean, I just wanted to kind of bring that as another aspect of where these cellular technologies are digital. So I'm sorry, again, I keep, go ahead, Pat.
If I could add to that,
Kathy, because she was
very quickly. Is that okay with you?
Go ahead, Pat.
Okay. So I wanted to add something to say, I don't agree with the current discussion. That it's a wireless tail that's attached to a wired network. There's a fellow named Elon Musk.
Heard of him.
Who is doing a few things in the sky that are wireless, that are hooked to wireless networks. And I've done deployments like that all over the world. What do we bring in? We bring up dishes and we hook them up to a Wi-Fi. Okay, we don't need any wired infrastructure. Elon Musk doesn't. And my view of the future of telecommunications is it's going to be all wireless, and good luck if you don't have a wireless communications capability, because you're going to fall behind. Why, as I say that? Primarily because of the regulation and restrictions that are in place. And you look at countries where they've embraced, or in applications areas like emergency services. I did deployments on BGAN satellite systems, 20 years ago. And we used those because that was what it would really work. Now Elon Musk and what he's doing, not just Elon, I mean, you look at the Europeans, you look at other people, there's this huge wave of fully wireless services.
I disagree. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm glad you do.
I disagree because the way the satellite, right now, and I try not to predict the future when it comes to technology, because you're usually going to be wrong on that. They don't have the speed. We've tried satellite before, particularly the download's fine. The upload is not good. To me, I see satellite as a supplemental technology, not a replacement technology for the system that Kathy described, where you don't use it necessarily as your primary internet, or a small number of people can use it as their primary internet. So that's just kind of where I see. I think I see a patchwork, and I know the mobile phone companies are working on that. T-Mobile leading the effort with partnering with SpaceX, to where if you go out of range of a tower, you do have access, and a lot of that is for first responders. But you're not, right now I could stream Netflix on my phone in 4K video. If I'm bouncing it off of Starlink, that's not going to happen. And so I don't know. So anyway, back to Kathy. I'm sure 10 minutes later, you still remember what you're talking about.
Yeah. So that, I think, gets to the next point. And what we're talking about is also, what are the metrics that we're looking at, right? So when you look at metrics that include, for example, cost, because Some of these technologies have very high dish costs.
Mhm.
$140 just to start, and then $120 a month. Okay, when we talk about affordability, that's way out of the affordability range for many, many millions of people, right? And there are also conditions in which satellite doesn't work very well. We also talk about the metrics about speed, both upload and download, right? So historically, a lot of internet policy really focused on download, the ability of people to download content. What we are seeing now, and frankly, what we are doing right at this moment, is we are creating content, video and audio content. We've also got some literature there and referring to a book. We are content creators, right? Rachel is a content creator through her papers. So upload is becoming as important as download. And then there's these other things you can look at in terms of delay, latency, other types of factors. And as well, the policies of the internet service provider. So one of the issues with the way that wireless has been run, and at least some satellites have been run too, is that if you use large amounts of upload or download, you can also be subject to slowing or throttling, they call it, especially during times of congestion. So this can be a real problem with reliability. And with using things, you mentioned, it's not just cat videos anymore. Video is really critical to increasingly how we teach, how we communicate with our doctor, how we monitor public safety, right? That all of these things are critical. And so that's why I think that looking at how do we increase access to the fiber backbone is important for neighborhoods like my old neighborhood in East LA, right? To have that capacity so that the kids in East LA don't need to be throttled, as they invent new things. And then, this can also support the Internet of Things, right? Which we can talk about, in the role of the Internet of Things, both in urban areas, but in things like disaster management and fighting fires and responding to disaster.
Well, this is a good time to do that. We're starting to, well, actually, we are basically out of time. So let me do two questions. Let's do the Internet of Things, and then we'll do AI, because any conversation about AI can't go very long. So we'll just Kathy, you were talking about the Internet of Things, and that is a huge, wide array. And so I want to see what your thoughts are. I have an example of something I want to discuss, but I don't actually want to put that in your mind. You wanted to talk about the Internet of Things in relation to the chapter and the conversation. Why did you want to do that? What were you thinking about?
So one of the things that our chapter talks about is, like, in addition to thinking about how do you communicate with people, right, to prepare for disaster and to say, hey, flood is coming,
Mhm.
right, get out, or proactively, move your kids, grandmas, and computers out of the flood zones, right? That there's also the Internet of Things, including, for example, these sensors in rivers that detect what's happening with the river and can warn of flood stage. And so, one of the things that we talked about is that the particular river channel, the Coyote Creek, that flows right through the city of San Jose in the heart of the Silicon Valley, that connects the Anderson Dam, it is the planned outlet for the Anderson Dam, had sensors run by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as by the Water District. But this data was really underutilized. And so one of the things that the chapter says is river gauge data were not linked to an action plan. While data flowed, actionable information did not, limiting situational awareness about the coming flood. So, this is, I think, part of what we've got to do is think about not just how do you make data flow, right, but how do you tie it to action plans, so that and make sure that the right people are getting information and that it's also communicating something meaningful. So, for example, some of these things said, oh, 10 feet, this is flood stage. Well, okay, there were a small number of people monitoring these things. Um, but the city didn't do anything, even though they had that information, until the river broke through doors and windows, and eventually 14,000 people had to be evacuated. So they waited until the flood instead of acting upon it. Right. So looking at how we can use the Internet of Things to warn us of coming dangers, you need an actionable plan to begin with. Right. And then looking at now you have the opportunity with things like drones, to be able to use drones, for example, where you had some of those areas that are not connected to cell phone service or mobile phone or landline, right? You used to have to bring what they called a cell on wheels, or a cell on light trucks, cows or colts, they call them. But now there's also cell on drones, where you can fly a drone that's connected to other resources. It's able to communicate that to help provide internet service. You can also do that with satellite, right? Again, if you've got the right dishes and receiving technology. But so the Internet of Things has become crucial to how we detect wildfire, right? Let alone in our houses, what's going on with temperature, or what's going on with the energy system. So we're going to see a proliferation of Internet of Things devices, and many of these are going to be AI enabled in the future. We're already seeing that, and that's growing. And it's one of the things that actually is going to increase data consumption. We're already seeing artificial intelligence increase demand on our electric grid, right? It is actually driving electric load consumption. And thus we need to think about, the greenhouse gas impact of artificial intelligence. But we can see as it becomes more bandwidth intensive, not just at the data center level, but at the user level, that it may actually increase further our need for broadband in a way that would exceed the limitations of many current wireless capabilities. And again, get back to the need for fiber to support these things, which really can help us through a whole variety of means.
So it sounds to me like there was, if not a policy failure, certainly an implementation or administrative failure when it came to the Internet of Things in this case, in that we had these sensors that could have been put in use for, connected to automatically notify. And it wasn't. And so, I think, that's a good ammunition going forward. I had a question a while ago, and you just reminded me, and I know we're coming up on time. So I'm going to ask the question of Pat and Kathy. Give me a short answer on this one. And, and I appreciate full explanations in policy matters. I think it's great. But to what degree, did the multiple overlapping political jurisdictions, cities, counties, et cetera, impact the policy coordination? City boundaries are to a degree artificial constructs. You can't see them from space for the most part. As George Carlin said, having a no smoking section in a restaurant's like having a no peeing section in the pool. The smoke doesn't know where the no smoking section ends. So the floodwaters don't know when they've crossed from one technologically forward jurisdiction to another. So to what degree did the jurisdiction issues, this multiple overlapping boundaries, impact the policy failure?
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. Sorry, and you look at also who's responsible for evacuation or rescue. They're completely different people than who's responsible for management and who's responsible for solving the problem. So, Pat, you may want to talk about, like, one of the solutions has been actually Santa Clara University, their innovation lab developed a technology called Flomasys, which we talk about in the chapter, that helped to better measure what was going on in that river, and better communicate. But it still needs to be fully connected by the responsible entities to an actionable plan. So Pat, to you.
It's interesting because both of you are reading my mind. Yeah, so we did this thing in Santa Clara. I was an advisor there, and we had the sensors and the whole thing, and it worked. I made the mistake of suggesting, since you had a sensor, there's another kind of sensor you can connect to this network. People use them all the time, a camera. The policies, I got involved in the city policies and the county policies in Santa Clara. Oh no, you can't have cameras because some people who may be upset having their picture taken, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so that was an example of a local policy, or I don't even know if it was a policy, maybe it was just a discussion point. I don't know, but it killed much of what we wanted to do. And I contrast that to, I did a very similar project in Thailand. Okay, the king wanted to make sure his area where industrial area didn't get flooded anymore. So we helped him. The US government helped him. There were no issues. I mean, the king said, you're going to do this. So there are no local jurisdictional issues or anything, no public policy issues. So that gets back to my original statement about it depends on the policy environment that you're in. And we have a more complex one.
Well, and that's an interesting tension. Before we get to the last question, that's an interesting tension. You know, everybody is upset about government deploying cameras for whatever reason, yet you walk down the street and there's Ring cameras everywhere and security cameras everywhere. And there's nothing that stops, you know, somebody from hacking into it, grabbing the video and uploading it to the internet. But for some reason, when a government, even for a proposal like that, you know, and that's the subject of a whole other series of podcasts. So
yeah, I bring it up just because the contrast with Thailand. That's all.
Yeah.
The
so
policy framework.
You gave us a good segue, Kathy, to go to AI. You know, there are multiple companies, T-Mobile included, that actually employ both Internet of Things and AI-powered Internet of Things for disaster prevention. So across the West region, which is, you know, we don't have the hurricanes, we have wildfires every year. I joke that I live in Sacramento now. You know, we have, you know, 6 seasons now. Most people only think of 4. We have 6. We have summer, spring, winter, fall, allergy, and fire. And sometimes we get allergies and fire twice a year. But across the West, you know, the rural fire departments, the state fire departments, and the utility companies have cameras that are way off in the wildlands, and they're connected via wireless networks because we're not running, you know, cable through hundreds of miles of forest land to get to these things, and they're powered by AI. And they have one purpose. It's not the generative AI that everybody hears about, where, you know, they detect wildfires. They've been trained on, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of images of wildfires, and so they take pictures and the AI scans it. And if there's no image of wildfire, nothing happens. If it thinks there may be wildfire, it draws a little, you know, mark, triangle, whatever it is, and it sends it to the fire station. In Washington last year, where I worked with the state through my job at T-Mobile, they deployed cameras, and the commissioner for public lands, who in California be their equivalent would be the natural resources secretary. The commissioner of public lands is a statewide elected official, oversees the state fire department. She had a press conference at the end of the year where she had announced she wanted to keep 90% of the wildfires in Washington under 10 acres. And she announced that they kept 95% of them under 10 acres. And she attributed, you know, obviously her firefighters, but the ability of those AI-powered Internet of Things cameras to automatically take pictures, read the pictures, and then when necessary, not automatically, but when necessary, communicate that back to somebody who could do something about it, as opposed to the old system, which was, I think I see a fire over, it might be. And so the ability to reduce the response time was significant. So Pat, I think that's a great example, not just of helping people when a disaster occurs, but minimizing the impacts, or perhaps connecting those same cameras to the notification systems that could then notify people who might be downwind of the fire. But you wanted to talk about AI. So I'm going to let you get in, for the most part, the last answer here, unless Rachel wants to add something, because obviously Rachel can always add something on AI as it relates to the policy discussions that we're having right now.
So AI, and I think was mentioned earlier about the power implications, the energy implications for AI are astronomical. And I just saw a business channel this morning talking about there are 6 locations in the United States that have reactors, but only one of them is actually really active. And in order to have a new entity put in, a new reactor put in.
Nuclear reactor you're talking about.
Nuclear reactor, right. So, and the reason I bring this up is because it's driven, the need seems to be, and the business need for these companies is their projections about AI and what the implications are. So that's one thing. I think that it's currently underestimated what the overall impacts are going to be. I think they're going to be huge. But in terms of the capabilities of AI, wow. I think that in medicine, you'll be having customized medicines for you individually that are designed just for you, based on your genetic makeup and so forth. And that's because of AI.
Well, already AI is excellent at detecting skin cancer. It's proven better than people at detecting skin cancer.
Yeah. So, and then you think of education. I have grandsons who were just graduated from college a couple of years ago. And because of COVID, they needed to write a lot of papers, and they used ChatGPT. A lot of students, now Rachel, you want to comment on this. Now, you probably never heard of a student using ChatGPT, and I'm sure Kathy has never heard of it either. Oh, and that's right. I forgot, Lloyd, you're involved in university now, so maybe. Yeah.
Well, the afterword to this book is an interview with ChatGPT. I sat down and I tried to figure out what to do for the afterword. And in my mind, I said, okay, I'm on stage with Bill Gates, but instead of interviewing Bill Gates as a technology leader, I interviewed ChatGPT.
Yeah, it's perfect. I mean, honestly, I like that chapter a lot because it really highlights what's coming down the road. And so it brings up another question in my mind is, are the policymakers even remotely aware of the implications? And are they going to be negatively pushed in the bad direction, my view, a bad direction, which would be limiting AI, or are they going to help nurture it?
Well, and I'm going to just chime in at the end as the former technology policymaker in the legislature. That worries me too. So much of the focus has been on generative AI and the negative implications of generative AI that I don't want to see, it painted with a broad brush. I'm not going to defend everything about generative AI. But don't, your spam filter, for example, in your email, that's AI. Your predictive text when you're typing, or your grammar check in Microsoft Word. Those are, well, you say, of course, but most people most people don't realize that that's just AI that's been specifically trained, just like the fire sensing cameras. And so I hope that government takes a more nuanced view of AI, because there are amazing potential for it. I am not like a lot of technologists that I see who run or come on to podcasts and give a blanket defense of technology. I am a policymaker who is in the technology world. And so I'm not going to just say, oh, all technology is good. No, there are concerns with some of it. But there's also huge benefits to a lot of it as well. So with that, I know we've gone quite a bit over time on this one.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah. So I want to say thank you guys both for this fascinating conversation. Enjoyed it greatly. Rachel, thank you as always for your perspective and insights. And join us next time as we discuss Chapter 4 in Technology versus Government, the Irresistible Force meets the immovable object, and we transition from the opening section of the book to the middle section of the book, where we put the emphasis and the focus on the people, because technology generally exists for people. We're going to look at the potential, as we talked a little bit about today already, the impact on e-government services and the focus on the customers of government and how technology and e-government relates to them. So join us next time for this podcast, Policy Chats, through UC Riverside. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
For this episode and the entire Technology versus Government podcast series, special thank you to the UC Riverside School of Public Policy for their support. Thank you, too, to Dean Mark Long, whose support of this entire project was essential to its success. A special thank you to the executive producer and the usual host of Policy Chats, Rachel Strassman. Without her diligent hard work, none of this would be possible. Thank you, too, to the Wall Street Journal Higher Education Initiative for supporting the podcast and their effort to spread the word on higher education and technology in government. Thank you to the Policy Chats team of committee members who volunteered to support and produce the Policy Chat series: Divya Bharadwaj, Dinara Godege, Derek Pedigo, Andrew Shannon, and Veer Sinha. Also, thank you to the team at the Hear Me Now recording studio for their excellent recordings of these podcasts: Jeff Holden, founder and principal, and Sawyer Malam, the technical director. And finally, thank you to Emerald Publishing for allowing me to publish this book that gave rise to the podcast series. Without those individuals, none of this would be possible, and they have my sincerest gratitude.
This podcast is a production of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and our theme music was produced by Veer Sinha. For the latest updates on the School of Public Policy, be sure to check us out at UCR_SPP on Instagram, or for more episodes and content, visit our YouTube channel. I'm Rachel Strassman. Till next time.